I never thought I'd end up alone in the back room of my sister's bookstore with her best friend's brother. Not that I'd ever imagined spending more than a few minutes with Claire, my sister's best friend's older sister, mid-40s, sharp as a whip, always dressed like she stepped out of a magazine. But there I was, standing awkwardly among stacks of unsorted novels, listening to her hum quietly while she sorted through a pile of returned hardcovers. I was supposed to help her carry some boxes to the back, nothing more. But the moment I stepped past the front counter, the shop felt different. Smaller, somehow, like the walls themselves were leaning in. Claire was crouched by a shelf, one hand brushing dust off a first edition of something I didn't recognize, the other steadying herself against the wood. She looked up at me then, and for a second, just a second, I thought she might have noticed something beyond the normal, young guy trying to be helpful thing I was doing. "You can, just put those there," she said, voice calm, but with that subtle hesitation that makes you pay attention. Her eyes flicked to mine, and I swear there was a question lingering there, unspoken, hovering in the space between us. I nodded, fumbling with the box, feeling my own hands grow warm in a way that had nothing to do with the dust. She stood, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and the sunlight from the tall front windows caught her just right, the kind of light that makes ordinary things feel charged. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. She glanced down at the books she had just placed, then back at me, and smiled ever so slightly, like she'd just noticed something about me that I didn't even know was visible. That smile, it stayed with me after I moved the box, longer than it should have. We fell into a quiet rhythm, me shuffling books, her arranging them, occasionally brushing against my arm by accident, or so I told myself. There was an awkward pause when I reached for a shelf at the same time as her, our hands meeting briefly. I don't know what I expected to happen. Nothing, probably. But the warmth of that contact lingered, a little spark that made the back of my neck tingle. Claire didn't comment. She didn't pull away. She just tilted her head and went back to the shelf, humming again. It was absurd how easy it was to forget the rest of the world in that tiny room with her. The clatter of the street outside, the distant sound of a car horn, even my own heartbeat. Everything faded into a sort of background noise I barely registered. I was hyper-aware only of her, the way she moved, the way she breathed, the small crease in her brow when she focused too hard on a particularly stubborn stack of books. She carried confidence in a way that made you want to mimic it, even when you knew you couldn't. When she finally straightened up and walked toward the counter, carrying a pile of poetry anthologies, I caught a glimpse of her profile, and something inside me shifted. I wasn't supposed to be feeling this, not for her, not yet. But there it was, a quiet pull, a tension that hung in the air like static, like the tiniest vibration of a chord just before it resonates fully. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Her presence filled the room, filled me, in ways I couldn't name. And when she paused at the doorway, glanced over her shoulder, and gave me that faint, almost imperceptible nod, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I still don't know why I remembered that moment later in the week, or why the thought of her humming softly while stacking books replayed itself in my head over and over. All I knew was that, for the first time, being alone with Claire felt like stepping into something I wasn't sure I wanted or dared to name. And I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at me, just once, in that small, quiet room. It wasn't planned, but I found myself back at the bookstore 2 evenings later, ostensibly to help Claire organize the inventory that had been piling up. The shop smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Her coffee, I realized, from the chipped mug sitting half full by the register. I'd started to notice things about her. The slight crease between her eyebrows when she concentrated, the way her hands hovered over a shelf before settling, the quiet way she hummed under her breath. She greeted me with a small nod, her eyes wary, and I thought for a moment she might ask me to leave. Instead, she handed me a stack of novels without a word, and I followed her toward the back room, careful not to step too close, careful not to breathe too loud. She moved with a quiet efficiency, but there was a stiffness to her today, a subtle retreat into herself. At one point, she leaned against the counter, rubbing her temple with the back of her hand. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but I hesitated, sensing the invisible line she had drawn between us. Still, I watched her, the way her fingers lingered over the edges of a book, tracing its spine almost unconsciously, the slight tremor in her hand when she adjusted the piles. The faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when she read a note scribbled in the margin of one old copy. It was the little things that struck me most, her laugh, quiet and almost reluctant, when a misfiled book fell at her feet. "You've got a lot here," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. She shrugged, a motion that seemed heavier than it should have been, like the weight of a week's worth of exhaustion pressed into that single gesture. "It's nothing," she said softly. But her eyes lingered on mine for a beat too long, and I could see the hesitation there, the vulnerability she wasn't ready to name. I shifted a box from one shelf to another, pretending not to notice how she glanced away, how her shoulders slumped just a fraction when she thought I wasn't looking. There was a pull in the silence between us, gentle but persistent, like gravity, and I could feel the way it tugged at me, at both of us, even if she refused to acknowledge it. At one point, she paused, resting her cheek lightly against the cool surface of the counter. Her breath came in a quiet rhythm, uneven, almost like she was holding something in. I wanted to reach out, to ask her what was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I watched and I waited, the silence stretching and folding around us. When she finally lifted her head, she met my gaze just long enough to make my chest tighten. No words passed between us, just a flicker of something. Hesitation, curiosity, maybe even recognition. The moment was so brief, so fragile, yet it left a trace, a faint hum of electricity that made me acutely aware of her presence. I stepped back to give her space, but I didn't want to leave. She straightened, adjusted her cardigan, and whispered something under her breath that I didn't catch, but her eyes told me everything. And in that silence, with the faint scent of coffee and old paper around us, I realized I couldn't stop noticing her. The way she moved, the way she existed, and I wanted, quietly, desperately, to be allowed closer. The rain had started quietly, then grown into a steady rhythm against the bookstore windows. I was helping Claire reorganize the fiction section, the smell of wet pavement creeping in each time someone opened the door. The shop was nearly empty, the only sounds her careful movements and the patter of rain. We reached for the same shelf at once, again, and our hands brushed. Not the casual touch from before. This one lingered a fraction longer than it should have. I felt her pull back slightly, just enough to remind me that boundaries still existed, but not enough to erase the electricity of contact. "Are you sure you want to be here this late?" I asked, trying to mask my nervousness with casual concern. She shrugged, avoiding my eyes. I like the quiet." Her voice cracked, just a little, and I noticed how tired she looked, the faint shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. Something about her fragility in that moment pulled at me. I wanted to reach out, to brush a stray hair from her face, but I didn't. We worked side by side, our movements careful, synchronous almost without thinking. There was a rhythm in it, two people aware of each other, aware of the charge in the air, but neither willing to name it. I felt my pulse quicken every time she leaned over a shelf or reached across me. And I realized with a sharp jolt that I was counting the moments until she'd leave, until the spell of proximity broke. Then her phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number. She glanced at it, hesitated, and stepped aside. I could hear the muffled voice of someone familiar, though she covered the speaker quickly, her expression tightening. She pressed her hand to her forehead, muttering something under her breath. I didn't pry. I stayed, silently, because this was the kind of moment you notice but can't force into conversation. When she returned, she leaned against the counter for a moment, brushing damp hair behind her ear. Our shoulders touched as she moved past me, and I felt my chest constrict. I wanted to say something, anything, but all that came out was a dry cough. Her eyes flicked to mine, sharp, almost knowing, and then she moved away, reorganizing books as if nothing had happened. The storm outside grew louder, a muffled roar that seemed to fill the gaps in our silence. I wanted to ask her if she needed help, or to stay, or to something, but I didn't. I just lingered near the shelf, my hands hovering over the books, pretending I was busy while my mind replayed every fleeting glance, every brush of skin, every whisper of hesitation. At one point, she bent over to reach a book from the bottom shelf, and I caught the scent of her perfume, subtle, a little sharp, but familiar now. My hand itched to steady her, to make the moment last, but I stopped myself. Instead, I froze, heart thudding in a rhythm that made the silence feel heavier, almost unbearable. She straightened slowly, and our eyes met, longer this time, and closer. I could have said something, leaned in, closed the distance that had been building for weeks. But I didn't. And as she finally turned to leave the back room, the storm thrumming around us, I realized I had been inches from something I couldn't name. The shop was nearly empty again, late in the evening. Claire was perched on a stool behind the counter, sorting through invoices, and I lingered near the doorway, trying to look busy but unable to ignore the way the dim light traced her face. The rain had stopped, leaving wet streets outside that reflected the golden glow of the street lamps. Everything felt hushed, as if the world outside had folded in, leaving only this tiny room and the weight between us. I cleared my throat. "Claire, can I ask you something?" She didn't look up. "Depends on what it is." Her voice was calm, but there was that familiar edge, guarded, almost fragile. I shifted, trying to find the right words. "This, whatever this is between us, are we just pretending it doesn't exist?" She froze, her hand lingering over a stack of papers. Her shoulders stiffened, her fingers tightening slightly around a pen. The silence that followed was so loud it pressed against my chest. She began, then stopped. She glanced at me, really looked at me, and I felt the intensity of her gaze like a hand on my shoulder. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice low, hesitant. "I don't understand it either." I swallowed hard. "It's like we keep walking close to the edge and pretending it's nothing. But it's not nothing, is it?" Her laugh was small, almost brittle, and it made something twist in my chest. "No," she whispered. "It's not nothing. We didn't move closer. We didn't touch. But the space between us felt impossibly charged, like static electricity ready to spark." I noticed the subtle tremor in her hands as she stacked invoices, the way her eyes darted away when they lingered on mine too long, the small bite of her lip that told me more than words ever could. I can't keep pretending I don't notice you," I said quietly, almost to myself. My own voice sounded foreign, raw. "Every time we're alone like this, it's like I can't breathe properly." She set the pen down and leaned back, crossing her arms, and for a moment, she didn't speak at all. Then, almost inaudibly, she said, I think we've been walking around each other too long. Afraid of what? I don't even know. And maybe it's already too late to stop noticing." Her honesty hung in the air, a weight neither of us wanted to name. I wanted to reach for her hand, to bridge the distance, but I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, taking in the tremor in her voice, the tension in her posture, the unspoken confession that trembled behind her eyes. We didn't need to speak for a long time. The quiet itself said everything: confusion, desire, fear, hesitation, and an aching awareness that this, whatever it was, wasn't normal. Finally, she looked at me again, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know if we're making a mistake, or if we're just afraid of being honest with ourselves." And then, softer still, almost a sigh, "But maybe it's too late for that now." I was shelving a stack of novels when I noticed her pause by the poetry section, fingers hovering over a worn hardcover. She hadn't noticed me yet, absorbed in the memory the book seemed to hold. I edged closer, careful not to startle her. You knew him, didn't you?" I asked softly, nodding toward the photo tucked between the pages. It was a small black and white snapshot, her younger self, smiling beside a man whose presence radiated a quiet intensity. Her shoulders stiffened, and she let out a slow breath. "I didn't think anyone would ever see that," she admitted. Her voice was low, almost reverent. She traced the edge of the photo with a fingertip, her knuckles turning white. He was everything I thought I wanted at the time. And then he left. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just watched her, noticing the faint tremor in her hands, the subtle slump of her shoulders that carried more than words ever could. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't calling for sympathy. She was just exposing a fragment of herself that she'd kept buried. "I blamed myself," she said quietly, eyes focused somewhere beyond me, beyond the shop, beyond the present. "I thought I ruined it. Thought I wasn't enough. For years, I kept it locked away." Something inside me tightened. I wanted to tell her that she wasn't broken, that no one could measure her worth by the loss of someone who couldn't stay. But I didn't. Words felt heavy, inadequate. I just waited, letting her unfold in front of me, letting her past press softly against the walls of the quiet store. She finally looked up at me, and for the first time, the guard slipped entirely. Her eyes glimmered with a mixture of shame and longing, something raw that demanded recognition. You, you make it harder to forget, she said, voice catching just slightly. You remind me that I once believed in someone fully, and I don't know if I can ever stop feeling that way. I wanted to close the space between us, to reach for her hand, but instead I took a step back. I let the silence do the work. I let her words hang, sharp and soft all at once. My chest ached in a way I hadn't expected, a quiet pressure that made my palms itch and my heart thrum. You shouldn't have to carry it alone, I murmured. Not a solution, not a reassurance, just an acknowledgement, a presence, a thread that tethered me to her confession. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and returned her gaze to the photo. I've spent so long pretending it didn't matter, she whispered. But maybe some things never really leave you. Maybe they just wait for the right person to notice. And in that moment, standing between stacks of books and the lingering scent of old paper, I realized that everything had shifted. Her past, her grief, her longing, they were no longer invisible to me. And somewhere deep inside, I understood that I had stepped into something far larger than either of us could name. She closed the book softly, pressing it to her chest, and glanced at me with a vulnerability that made my breath catch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was seismic, and it left a quiet tremor running through me that I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore. The shop was empty except for us, and the late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, dust motes dancing like tiny sparks. Claire was perched on the edge of the counter, a stack of unsorted invoices beside her, and I was crouched by the lower shelves, pretending to arrange books but acutely aware of her presence. We had been working in silence for the better part of an hour, the tension between us neither spoken nor ignored. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, inevitable, the way a current pulls at you whether you're ready or not. At some point, she looked up and caught me watching her. Not in a confrontational way, not teasing, just noticing, really noticing. The faint curve of her lips as she read something on a page, the way her hair fell over her shoulder, the subtle lines around her eyes that made her laugh feel warm instead of measured. I'm tired, she admitted softly, leaning back. Not just now, everything. I've been carrying too much. I stayed where I was, hands on the shelf, trying not to move too quickly. You don't have to do it alone, I said, almost as a reminder to both of us. Her eyes met mine then, steady, unflinching. There was no sparkly, cinematic revelation, just a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that sinks in slowly but with weight. She didn't reach for me, and I didn't step closer. We existed in the same space, letting the silence say everything that words couldn't. She sighed, soft, long, and I could see the tension leave her shoulders in that single breath. I took a careful step toward her, tentative, and she didn't move away. My fingers brushed hers as I adjusted a book nearby, and for the briefest moment, our hands lingered. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it said everything: recognition, understanding, patience, acceptance. We didn't speak. There was no, "I love you," whispered into the quiet. There didn't need to be. The unspoken truth hovered between us, tangible in its simplicity. We had crossed a threshold, not one of passion, not yet, but one of honesty, intimacy, and a choice to stay present with each other. She leaned back a little, resting her forehead against the cool wood of the counter, eyes closed. I knelt beside her, close enough to feel the faint warmth of her shoulder against mine. The shop around us felt distant, irrelevant, the mundane world outside no longer pressing in. And in that small, quiet way, everything settled. There were no fireworks, no confessions shouted over a storm, no cinematic gestures. Just two people, aware of each other, breathing in sync, acknowledging the inevitable pull they could no longer resist. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked at me, and we both understood. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't flawless. It was real, earned, and fragile, but solid in the only way that mattered. Our hands separated slowly, reluctantly, a silent agreement passing between us. And for the first time, we didn't need words to mark the moment. The air between us held it all: understanding, trust, the quiet collapse into something that felt like the beginning, without needing to name it. I still think about that night in the bookstore, the quiet, The way the dust motes hung in the light, the faint brush of her hand against mine. It wasn't cinematic or perfect. It wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic confessions. It was small, fragile, and yet somehow monumental. Looking back, I realized that moment changed everything. Not in the way you'd expect. There was no sudden leap into a fairy tale, but in the way you notice gravity has subtly shifted beneath your feet. Claire didn't need to say she felt the same. I didn't need to claim it for her. The acknowledgement, the shared presence, the quiet collapse into understanding, that was enough. I've learned a lot about patience and observation, about seeing someone fully without rushing to own them, about how quiet gestures, small acts of care, and unspoken acknowledgement can carry more weight than words ever could. I've learned that love isn't always explosive. It can be gentle, persistent, and transformative in ways you only notice later. And I've learned about her too. Claire carries her past with her like a soft shadow, regret, heartbreak, longing, but she also carries a strength I hadn't fully appreciated until I spent hours, days, weeks, simply being near her. She taught me that being present, being patient, and noticing someone's subtleties can matter more than trying to fix anything. Sometimes I catch myself replaying tiny moments. The way she laughed quietly when a book slipped, the faint crease in her brow when she concentrated, the slight tremor in her hands when she revealed a memory she'd tucked away for years. Those fragments live in me now, small anchors that remind me how layered she is, and how layered love can be when it's unforced, unclaimed, and real. It didn't end with fireworks or a perfect resolution. Life isn't always tidy, but it ended with a truth we both could hold. That connection, once recognized, changes you. It reshapes your understanding of patience, intimacy, and the kind of care that doesn't demand a title. And somehow, in the quiet afterglow, that felt enough. Sometimes, I still catch myself thinking about her, not in a desperate or obsessive way, but in a way that makes the ordinary feel luminous. Seeing someone fully and being seen in return is rare. And when it happens, even in small, fragile ways, it leaves traces you can't erase. And maybe that's the point. The way love lingers doesn't always demand action. Sometimes it's enough to notice. Sometimes it's enough to stay present. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?